Hello, my name is Jack Bennett and this is my presentation on perfect competition and monopolistical competition for the class Managerial Economics. In a perfectly competitive market, there are many firms and no one firm has complete control. It is a market where prices are dictated by supply and demand, and as a result of this, no one firm can take control of the market. It is important to differentiate this because if one firm had control, that would be a monopoly. As a result of this, all firms are price takers, and barriers for entry to the market are relatively low, and firms can enter and exit to the market easily. Contrary to a monopolistic market, a perfectly competitive market has many buyers and sellers, and consumers can choose where they buy their goods and services. In a perfectly competitive market, the companies do just about enough to stay afloat, and nothing more. If they were to earn excess profits, other companies could enter the market and drive profits down. An interesting way of differentiating between perfect competition from others was introduced to me when I read an article by Luca Zamparelli. It states, contrary to the classical tradition where competition erases profits, in perfect competition, there is not a requirement for the absence of profits. Now moving on to monopolistic competition. So monopolistic competition lies somewhere between a monopolistic market and a perfect competition market. In monopolistic competition, there are many producers and consumers in the marketplace, and all firms only have a degree of market control. In contrast to a monopoly, but similar to perfect competition, monopolistic competition offers very few barriers to entry. All firms are able to enter the market if they feel the profits are attractive enough for their firm. However, this is key. In a monopolistically competitive market, there is product differentiation. Products in a monopolistic competition are close substitutes. The products have distinct features such as branding or quality. This is unlike both a monopolistic market, where there are no substitutes for products, and perfect competition, where the products are identical. Firms in a monopolistically competitive market have price inelastic demand. They are price makers, another key difference. Because the good is highly differentiated, meaning that there is a perception that the goods are different for reasons other than just the price, there are perceived differences between the product of one firm and that of its rivals, so some customers may value it more than the other. Another characteristic of monopolistically competitive firms is high short-term profits and normal long-term profits. This is because, due to the freedom of entry, supernormal profits will encourage more firms to enter the market, leading to normal profits in the long term. Now we're going to go through some examples of both perfect competition and monopolistic competition. But first, consider, in the real world, no market is purely monopolistic or perfectly competitive, so no one of these examples is totally perfect. Our first example of perfect competition is online shopping. For online retailers, there are many buyers and sellers of similar products, a good characteristic of perfect competition. There is the ability to gather perfect information through the wonders of the internet, and there's easy entry into the market. So, whilst companies such as Amazon and eBay perhaps do have a strong market share, this is close to a good example as any. So note that the similarities between online retailers and my previous definition of perfect competition. So there are multiple retailers, but they all some sell very similar products. Obviously this is largely dependent website per website. You can't compare one website like Foot Locker to another website that sells something like Home Depot, because they aren't comparable. But like I said, there's no perfect examples. My second example of perfect competition is a foreign exchange market. This is probably as close to perfect as we're going to get. In foreign exchange markets, traders exchange currencies like the US dollar or the Great British Pound or the Euro, but the product is homogeneous. So whilst there are different buyers and sellers, there is only one version of each currency. With that said, there is an exception in the fact that traders may not have perfect information. Normal buyers and sellers may be at a disadvantage compared to professional traders too. Now moving on to my examples of monopolistic competition. Firstly, TV programs. So there is easy market entry for TV programs. It's easy to start a streaming or service or pay to get a slot on TV. And there is a huge variety and diversity of TV programs from all networks around the world. So there is many channels and streaming providers. And consumers can choose between domestic channels, but also imports from other countries and news services like Netflix. But it is important to recognize, as I stated before, how this falls into the monopolistic category is because every channel offers something slightly different, or every streaming service offers something slightly different. For example, they offer different genres. Some networks only stream one particular, like Comedy Central, for example, whereas some networks focus on more serious dramas. You get the idea. But one consideration for this topic too is that as more and more streaming services are added, you begin to wonder about the profitability of them. So as we mentioned before, there is a massive potential for high profits to start with, but as more and more people join, you begin to wonder about those normalizing towards the end. Secondly, we look at restaurants as our second monopolistic example. Similar to TV programs, it's easy to form a restaurant, to start a restaurant, and every single restaurant has slightly different options in terms of cuisines per restaurant and stuff like that. So, but it's also important to recognize that restaurants compete for the quality of food as well, as much as price. Whilst product differentiation is a key element of this business, you look at different qualities in stuff like you look at your fast foods and you look at your higher end stuff as well. An interesting counterpoint for these though is that I looked at an article by the author Tamsin McMahon, and it made me think that perhaps the category of restaurants might need defining slightly more, since, as I mentioned before, you look at your McDonald's and then you look at something like Red Lobster. I hardly see them in the same category since there's actually been a new category formed called fast casual chains. And then you've got your higher end restaurants, and then you've got fast food. So it's difficult to put a definition on all of them and throw them all into the same category here. So it's just worth considering. Again, as I mentioned, there are no perfect examples. So now we've looked at some examples and definitions of both perfect competition and monopolistic competition. We're going to look at how monopolistic competitive firms maximize their profits. So the monopolistic competitive firm maximizes profits where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Therefore, a monopolistic competitive firm demand curve is downward sloping. This in turn means that it will charge a price that exceeds marginal costs. The market power possessed by a monopolistic competitive firm means that at its profit maximizing level of production, there will be a net loss of consumer and producer surplus. The second source of inefficiency in this process is the fact that these firms operate with excess capacity. The firm's profit maximizing output is less than the output associated with minimum average cost. All firms, regardless of the type of market it operates in, will produce to a point where the demand or price equals average cost. In a perfectly competitive market, this occurs where the perfectly elastic demand curve equals minimum average cost. In a monopolistic competitive market, the demand curve is downward sloping. In the long run, this leads to excess capacity. So when you look at the main causes for this profitability in comparison to something like perfect competition, the main reason the monopolistic competitive firms can do this and perfectly competitive firms can't is what we talked about before, the product differentiation. So differentiation affects performance primarily by reducing direct opposition. As the product becomes more different, categorization becomes more difficult, and the product draws fewer comparisons than before. And that's where this type of firm separates itself from a perfectly competitive firm in which there is no differentiation and everything is the same and therefore everything costs the same because they have no reason to price it otherwise. So with all of this said, I'm now going to sort of finish with some concluding thoughts on both of the topics. So, perfect composition mainly exists in textbooks, and monopolistic competition is slightly more realistic, but again is largely a thought which is used to define a process rather than something exact. And this is why. So perfect competition might have existed previously when commodities were the main source of economic activity. In particular, you look at your previous times where coal, oil, metal were absolutely essential for daily life and massive parts of the economy. Times now have changed. We now live in a society and an economy where firms compete by offering different products. So more like monopolistic, as I said before. Customers now rely on brands as a form of obtaining information. Therefore, the term perfect information doesn't really exist. It's not really achievable. In prior centuries, however, perfect information was easier to get because so few products were readily available. Yet today there is millions of each type of product. So as I mentioned before, monopolistic competition is slightly more realistic, but the reality of it is some firms will be better at brand differentiation than others, and therefore in the real world they will be able to make supernormal profit. In monopolistic competition, there is assumptions, there is no barriers to entry. In the real world, there is most likely going to be some for all industries, really. Another nuance is that if a firm has strong brand loyalty, which is huge nowadays, and product differentiation, this itself becomes a barrier to entry. A new firm can't easily capture that brand loyalty. It takes time to build up. Many industries we may describe as monopolistically competitive are very profitable as well. So that brings into question what we previously mentioned about supernormal and then normal profits. So the assumption that normal profits are a long run thing is too simplistic. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed. So yeah.